Thanks to Simon and the festival for inviting me for a second time to address you. I'm here to talk about 1918 primarily from the point of view of the British government and British government in Ireland. But before I do so, I want to pick up on a couple of things that Pj Maloney has said. One is his discussion of Hungary. I think it's enormously important that we, as he has done as a senior political figure, not simply that to mention other places in the world where difficulties arise, where history is abused and so on, but to relate it to the complex politics of our own national rhetoric and so on, be it to do with the European Union or to do with Northern Ireland and the Fourth Green Field and so on. I was in Hungary in 2000 on a NATO-sponsored sort of get-to-know-us trip, and it was in the Hungarian Ministry of Defence. I was amazed. Their Hungary was explicitly in discourse. It was the pre-Treaty of Trianon Hungary. So it involved lots of Romania, bits of Slovakia and so on. And they were unabashed about this. Now they were saying we can't get it back, but it is ours. It was amazing that and one of the great strengths of the European Union and of NATO, I hate to say it of course, is that the conditions for joining is that you have to park these irredentist ambitions or whatever. And with that goes the deal that your minorities abroad, everybody has to recognise and not cosset, but look after the interests of each other's minorities. And however artificial at times that may seem, it has been proven to be a far better way of dealing with the complexities of the end of European empires and outside Europe than the alternative, which, as we saw in Yugoslavia, on Austria's doorstep in the 1990s consisted, once the disciplines collapsed, it turns out that Europeans can turn on other ethnicities just as quickly, as we should know from the Second World War, just as quickly as can people in Asia or whatever. The other thing I said to Micheál Martin, I agree with him in trying to get him to get used to All Ireland finals in the middle of August. He'll also, as a Corkman, have to get used to watching them as neutral. But that can't be helped. I'm from Dublin, where the story at the moment is briefly different. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about British government in Ireland during 1918. Does anyone have the time? Because I generally, without a watch, I can only tell by how many people fall asleep. Okay, well, maybe at quarter to you'll ring a bell. Yeah, ring a bell, yeah, because I'm sure I won't have started by then. But as well as talking about the castle, I just want to offer some wider reflections. I was going to talk about the influenza outbreak and so on, which obviously is enormously important. I think there are other dimensions of Irish history that we are in danger of being forgotten and swamped by the sort of national centenary. And even Louise will be speaking about women and the vote. And I mentioned this morning my unease that this is being addressed in a commemorative form almost entirely in terms of linked to separatism and to the attainment of independence and so on in this part of the island. And it's slightly awkward that so much of the history of Irish and development of Irish society in this era, it always tries to be fitted into. We saw it in 2013 with the Dublin lockout, which, as Port Yates, who's the best historian of it, pointed out, is nothing almost to do with Irish separatism. After all, the Irish Parliamentary Party were very much against James Larkin and Larkinism, but yet it was kicked off as the first part in 2013 of the Decade of Commemorations, which I have some role as one of the advisors to the government. So almost everything good that happens gets tied into a sort of progressive narrative of moving towards independence. Do you see what I mean? Which may or may not be a good thing. And in that connection, in some ways I was pleased, but also rather alarmed. On Thursday I was in Dalgan Park near Navan. I don't know if any of you know Dalgan Park. It's the home of the Columban missionaries. I wasn't there pursuing a late vocation. I was there because one of my dad's younger brothers was celebrating his 60th jubilee of his ordination as a Columban missionary. The Columban Missionary Society was established, got going in 1918 as the Maynooth Mission to China. Right? And so you had, what does that represent in terms of some sense of confidence within the Irish Catholic Church that they would be going, and the Church of Ireland were already, there's a Trinity-based mission, Church of Ireland, I can't remember where, north of Shanghai, if you look at the newspapers, who are also very active, but they're already there. There's Presbyterian missions going out from Belfast. So you have this other set of interests that are galvanising parts of Ireland. Do you see what I mean? Parts of Irish society which aren't directly political at all, which are very powerful. The Columbans now, in a sense, as an Irish order, are almost at an end. There were 4 priests who were celebrating their 70th anniversaries of ordinations. The ones who were celebrating 25, there might have been 20. But there's no young priests left. So that immense burst of energy has come and gone in a century. But it's in the same century that Ireland became independent, right? But you can't tie the two together. But I think it's a pity that that sort of enterprise, if it is to be looked at all, is liable to get looked at as somehow part of Ireland, waving the green flag abroad. Do you see what I mean? Rather than us probing the reasons why either the Catholic Church in Ireland and the authorities in Rome, or young men, mainly from the west and north. My uncles, various uncles who joined were from joined in Donegal, but Donegal, Kerry, Mayo. It's the Columbans are primarily Western Seaboard movement. But why the church would allow them almost to go? Because do you see what I mean? They were being whipped out. They could have become perfectly good, curates and parish priests within the island of Ireland. But there was sufficient confidence in Irish Catholicism and sufficient energy to launch this place. People were sent to China, some of whom got killed quite quickly by bandits and so on. Young men who had never been to Dublin. Because they were originally, the seminary was in Mayo. and it's just an extraordinary example of other kinds of histories, do you see what I mean? Which aren't tied directly, as far as we see, into the political narrative, and which in some ways we're in danger, I think, of either not looking at or looking at only in terms of what did they think about death. So I hope that I've said that. I also want to say something I've already mentioned my family twice, but about we're moving into an awkward era of commemorations and centenaries, where some of us will be saying, my grandfather would never have shot an unarmed man. Right? Or in the case of West Cork, my grandfather was never sectarian, or whatever. Right? So we're moving in some ways into things which at local level, perhaps more than at national level, are awkward commemorations. Right? And so I think in some ways we have to be careful, but I think also we have to try to be objective, and we have also to try, as Micheál Martin said, not to try to link the past to the present in some particular political triumphalist narrative or whatever, or exclusionary narrative. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, I won't say it at West Cork, or I certainly won't mention Kilmichael, God help us, right? But it's perfectly reasonable to say, to quote Sean Lamass in 1969, of the Civil War, which could apply to the War of Independence, both sides did terrible things. Right? Okay? And I think one of the benefits of the centenary of the Rising, which in some ways was enormously constructive, I would have said in political sense, and also the mainstream political parties effectively, very largely took an active role, particularly the state and the defence forces of the state, in sort of taking back the flag from others who would otherwise have been wearing it and claiming unique ownership of it. But we have to explore, we have to understand, we may, in some areas, have to accept that our grandparents may have suffered, or great-grandparents, sorry, there's young people here, but also that some of the activists may indeed have done terrible things, rightly or wrongly. And this is a matter which, as an historian, because I root around in archives and so on, and deal with memories of various kinds that you encounter within your own family narrative as well as outside. I don't say it of any of you here, that it will be like that. So to say a little bit about British policy in Ireland in 1918, we have to remember, and again in Ireland, everybody knows it, but you have to say it again and again, there was a war on, a world war, right, in which Britain was vitally involved. and the energies of the British cabinet under the most, in some ways I would argue, the most brilliant Prime Minister of the last century. I don't have to discuss Theresa May because she wasn't there then. David Lloyd George, the most brilliant social reformer of his era by far as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Absolutely fearless. He in terms of national health insurance, which he introduced over the dead bodies of the British medical establishment, in terms of taxing the rich, what a terrible thing to do in terms of introducing income tax and so on. He was just extraordinarily courageous for his era, but also so extraordinarily effective. And Lloyd George comes to power in December 1916 in succession to Herbert Asquith, a Liberal who had been Prime Minister at the time of the Rising, who I won't say oversaw, but in a vague way managed the British response to the Rising, which was on the one hand initially severe in terms of the executions and deportations, including one man I'll be talking about, whose journal I found, Pj Maloney of Tipperary, and then perhaps wisely, but adopted a policy of a kind of conciliation towards Ireland, a conciliation which wasn't received well, but a policy of trying to do as little as possible about Ireland and to stir the place up as little as possible. And that continued into the era of David Lloyd George. Lloyd George did launch a political initiative known as the Irish Convention, which was seemed to be the kind of last chance whereby, in the context of the terrible war that was going on, surely the constitutional politicians of Ireland, unionists as well as nationalists of varying persuasions and people of varying religious backgrounds, could come together and agree on some kind of workable home rule settlement for the greater good of the United Kingdom as well as for the future of Ireland. And the convention, which ran in Trinity College from July 1917 until March 1918, the British government invested some hope in this. Not necessarily that it would come up with the definitive solution agreed by all, but that it might at least keep Ireland off the cabinet table, right? Because the extent of the world problems with which Lloyd George in particular, this amazing political talent, in my view, he after all negotiated the treaty, but with which he was faced. He was leading a coalition government, including very committed unionists, Andrew Bonar Law, who was, after all, the unionist leader, one of whose son was killed in the war in 1915, a second one was killed in 1917. Asquith, whom he succeeded, lost his favourite son in June 1916. Leading a coalition which was not, I mean, in some ways had been bitterly historically split on the issue, the parties of Home Rule for Ireland, right? But who were all men who, by and large, lots of people who had suffered personal loss and were in dread that their own children were soon going to fall. So the hope of Ireland was you try to keep it off the table. The paradox was they were not very successful. Anyone who's read British Cabinet records, I don't expect you to have read them all. But what's amazing about the British Cabinet records from 1917 on, because Lloyd George revolutionised the way British government works, so you have proper memoranda, you have proper minutes, you have all this procedural material which you didn't have previously. So it's really interesting to work through. But Ireland comes up again and again and again. And it comes up partly because the minister plucked from obscurity, H.E. Duke, in June 1916, is persuaded to take on the job of Chief Secretary for Ireland. Up to that, Asquith had dealt legally with the role of Chief Secretary after Augustine Birrell resigned on the outbreak of the Rising. But Duke is appointed, and Duke in some ways is a good choice. He's a unionist, but he doesn't have a union. He's not a sort of embittered Ulsterman. He's the southwest of England. He's a distinguished lawyer, but he's not part of the party establishment, and he's a sort of a general nice fellow. And for nearly 2 years, he attempts to manage Ireland, if you like. He doesn't try to fix things. What he tries to do is keep the lid on things. And he tries to keep the lid on things primarily by doing it as little as possible to stir up as few people as possible. Do you follow me? But the problem with Duke, if you read the records, is that he's forever asking the cabinet, please, sir, can I do this? Please, sir, can I do this? Please, sir, there are boys in the back of the class talking. Please, sir, there are... You know what I mean? He's like an unconfident teacher. And so you have the paradox that while really what Britain wants to do in terms of running its war is just to get Ireland, just leave it over there, right? You have the paradox that Ireland comes up again and again and again and again in British cabinet business, which is why in some ways it's quite easy to chart. Now, there had been a rising in Ireland. We remember this. Sometimes we forget this was a rising which was organised in conjunction with Germany, right? In that it was very similar to risings or attempted risings across the world in the First World War. This was not a unique event because the Germans, those nasty people, were trying to stir up, for example, people I'm studying at the moment, they're trying to stir up the Afghans to go to war. The Germans and the Turks jointly, the Afghans said, that's interesting, but in the end they didn't bite. Elsewhere they were trying to make trouble in the Middle East and so on. But then what were the British doing in the Middle East? They're manipulating, what I'm saying is they're manipulating separatist feeling, they're manipulating religious feeling as well. Most of us seen, well, you're probably too young to have seen, but I went to see David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia. What was T.E. Lawrence, of course, of an Irish extraction? What was he doing? He was promising Arab Muslims an Arab Muslim political entity, free of the Turks, they're fellow Muslims, but Turks, so we want to get rid of them, right? And that was the prize that they offered. Now, in practice, what the British did deliver ultimately was Saudi Arabia, right? Which, of course, is still with us. We can discuss Saudi Arabia later. But what I'm saying is what happened in Dublin in 1916 is not a unique event in terms of the First World War. It's what every power was trying to do to every others in everyone else's back door, right? The same for Russia, the Turks themselves. You could never trust the Turks. Everybody's at it. And the irony is that the one in which Germany invested the least, which was Dublin, they didn't give a curse about Ireland, they knew there was no hope, as it were, was the one that worked. But it worked in Ireland, but you may note, what impact did it have on the conduct of the wider world, this revolution, this rebellion in Ireland? How many Irish units refused to fight at the front? If I'd been an Irish unit at the front, I'd refuse to fight, not because of the rising, but because I'd think, God, I'm going to be killed. But how many? None. How many mutinies were there? Well, you can argue about the Connaught Rangers, but that's much later in 1920, and it's a very confused story anyway in India. Right? How many Irish sailors refused to do their duty? None. Absolutely none. It's amazing. Lack of impact at the time. It's like a long-term asbestos or something. If you like, it's something which at the time you don't realize has profound long-term effects. But in terms of the immediate conduct of the war, what's amazing about the Rising is how little the impact was. And that, to some extent, I think, reduced British concerns, but it also reduced British concerns about the toxicity of German interest in Ireland. Right? Even though they had some evidence from after the Rising that some leaders of the separatist movement were continuing to try to get Germany to help some more. And even though the Germans were in a tiny way saying, oh yes, we'll help you, and so on. Right? But it did not worry Britain remotely. The idea there would be another German-inspired rebellion in Ireland than the fear that the Germans had managed finally to do something in India. It didn't remotely worry the British at all. So somehow Ireland, even in terms of subversion, was not as important. Having said that, in the middle of 1918, March 1918, Britain, for entirely British strategic manpower reasons, takes a panic decision that they're going to apply the Military Service Act to Ireland, right? What we call the Conscription Crisis. Now, we know that there had been a conscription crisis in South Africa, conscription crisis in Australia, conscription crisis in Canada, right? Where those French Canadians, bloody can never trust the French Canadians in particular, say, why do we want, they say it in French, they say, why do we want to go and fight this weird war, right? But in Ireland, it's particularly acute. And the point is that the people in Dublin Castle who will be charged with implementing conscription, enforcing conscription, Duke, the minister, says, will be a calamity. He resigns. The head of the army eventually said, well, it might work. The head of the police, an Irish Catholic who'd been put in explicitly because he's an Irish Catholic after the Rising, says this will be a disaster. Almost all the local experts, as it were, who are pseudo-experts in the castle, they get that one right. They say this won't work, right? But London, because of the wider political imperatives, because the fear that Germany has mounted such an extraordinary offensive that just millions more troops are required ultimately to stem the enemy that can be found in Britain itself or that can be found in the colonies or whatever. There's only so many million Indians that you can sort of pull into the war as they did, or Africans or whatever. The Irish are going to have to do their bit, and this is linked then we'll introduce conscription and we'll introduce home rule. But of course, home rule hasn't been defined or articulated or whatever. And having made this calamitous decision, right, the British government then proceeds ultimately to do what? They just say, nah. They say, should we try something else, right? So having said this is imperative, it is, we are defending the empire. Ireland must take her place. The key sort of unionist voice, if you like, on this, Walter Long, who had very strong attachment to Ireland. I think he was married to a daughter of the Earl of Cork or something, or maybe, isn't that right? But Long writes to Lloyd George that if you just face up and tell them to sit down, behave themselves, you'll soon have 200,000 to 300,000 fine fighting Irishmen in the ranks. This is absurdly optimistic that if you talk tough enough to the Irish, you'll be able to they'll knuckle under, because Paddy likes a bit of discipline, and ultimately he likes a fight. Look at the way he drinks and whatever, and we'll get him in uniform and put discipline in the place, and it will reshape Ireland, and it'll be great. But I have to say that Dublin Castle, who's often blamed for the wrongs of British government in Ireland, they say no, this will be a calamity. It won't work. It'll cause, there'll be fight after fight if you try to implement it. Even the army in Ireland, as I mentioned, the GOC eventually said, well, it might work, but they don't want to be in a position where they are recruiting at the point of a gun, right? Because they still have an interest in voluntary recruiting, because voluntary recruiting continues in Ireland. I mean, a prime example of this, just after the war, James Daly, the Connaught mutineer, was executed in 1920. For the Connaught Rangers mutiny, that he joins in the army in 1919, right? Ireland is still a source of manpower, and of course it's also a very important agricultural producer and so on. So there's arguments against disrupting Ireland, which in the end are seen to be, well, okay, we'll go that way. But by then the damage had been done, because the threat of conscription had produced a unifying of very disparate forces, particularly on the nationalist side. We should note, though, that Ulster Unionists didn't want conscription either if it was going to be applied to them, right? But they could afford to keep quiet about this because the nationalists made the running for them. And ultimately, the British government had the worst of both worlds. It was as though Michael Gove or somebody had gone back and tried to, or Boris Johnson or whatever, this fiasco where they absolutely transformed the dynamic of separatist politics, if you like, in Ireland, without actually getting any even immediate benefit for it. A consequence of that, what's the time, Chair?
We're about 1:45.
Okay, I'll go on for about another, 10 minutes, 2 hours. Okay. A consequence of that disastrous decision, and Micheál Martin was once a minister, he'll know that sometimes decisions are taken. Nobody knows why they took them, but Jesus, that was, it wasn't. Afterwards, yeah, it wasn't me. I was out of the room at the time. Or in the case of Boris Johnson, I was talking to the Deputy Foreign Minister of Afghanistan. But you get this calamitous decision, which, as I say, the people in the castle said won't work. And sure enough, it didn't work. But ironically, to some extent, what they predicted would happen also didn't happen, because Ireland is relatively quiet once the Conscription Crisis dies down, once the British government backs down and other things happen elsewhere and attention moves away. Ireland actually becomes, in terms of police reports and so on, for the remainder of the year, surprisingly calm. right? There is some political violence, which I'll say a bit about at the end. But it is striking. But what you get, and what is taken as being the Castle's revenge and London's revenge for the conscription fiasco, is that in April 1918, two things happened. One is that Lord French, who had been a rather inept, he had commanded the British Expeditionary Force in 1914 in France, a man of Irish, or perhaps you'd call him Anglo-Irish background, a very dashing cavalry officer with mistresses everywhere, unpaid bills the world over. But actually, in terms of overall leadership, bizarrely, almost Blackadder-like figure. Is sent to Ireland as a kind of generalissimo. He becomes Lord Lieutenant, but with the authority, as he sees it, to overrule the civilian government, to control the GOC in Ireland, and so on. Which, of course, none of these arrangements work. But initially, you have this high theatre of this cavalryman who understands the Irish because he's Irish himself, and he's going to knock them into shape and make them patriotic again. And one of the first products of his administration is the discovery of a German plot. Now, I don't know if any of you have... some of you may be involved in armed conspiracies of one sort or another. But the German plot is in effect, it looks like retaliation against the public head of the Sinn Féin movement, those who are prominent and visible in it. It's used as a reason to arrest 73 people who are seen as leading figures. And one of them is a man called Pj Maloney. Now, quite by chance, Maloney, who was from Tipperary Town, in 1916, after he was the president of the volunteers in Tipperary Town. Tipperary didn't rise in 1916, as we know. He was the president. It means he was a bit old to be the military leader, but he was a political figurehead. He was arrested at the age of about 1947, immediately after the rising, and interned for about a month or so in Britain. Well, the point is, he wrote a journal while in prison. He wrote an account of his political development and of why he saw himself as a Parnellite. And the reason he was in favour of rising in Ireland was because of the British betrayal of the promises to Parnell and ultimately to Redmond, right? So he didn't see himself as starting out as an Irish Republican, and he didn't, in this account he wrote in 1916, see himself at all as a... He saw a continuity in his own political views and so on. Now, it's of particular interest to me. He starts writing this journal. I decided, quote, to occupy myself by writing in plain language my experience since arrest and so on. Now, the Home Office write about this. This is a Jeremiad, a dreary catalogue of complaints, correct in grammar, and shows the author to be a person of some education. But they won't give it back to him. So there's an 80-page document still in the National Archives in Kew, and it describes his so on. And it's full of Éireann go bragh and phrases like that, even though he admits to his shame that he can't speak Irish, because he's visited by an Irish-speaking Jesuit in Scotland. He had a son in the Jesuits, and he doesn't know what the man is saying, because he never took the trouble to learn Irish himself. But the interesting thing about this, Maloney is lifted in May 1918. He never got his journal back. And this shows you the continuity of things. And this is just as well, because in November 1920, his premises, he was a pharmacist in Tipperary Town. He was my great-grandfather, was burnt down by Black and Tans, right? And with that burning would have gone this very interesting idiosyncratic narrative of how he saw his link to Parnellism into Sinn Féinism as a completely natural extension of what Parnell had been looking for, rather than as a radical departure. Now, Maloney, again, is an interesting figure because he's so typical of so many people who become part of the revolution. He becomes the TD in 1918. He's TD till 1923, votes against the treaty or whatever. But of his 8 children, he has 4 stepchildren, the youngest of whom, when he's arrested in 1916, is in Macedonia, flying with the Royal Flying Corps. Of his 4 children, the eldest of whom would be 2 years younger than that chap, my grandfather, they all joined the IRA, or in the case of May, come along and become senior figures. One of them gets killed in 1921. But he's an essentially bourgeois figure, as I say, a Parnellite, who through, as he sees it, not through his becoming more radical, but through the continuous failure of Britain to honour, as it were, the Home Rule pledge, that he, as I say, he finds himself on the Sinn Féin side of the argument, what becomes known as the Sinn Féin side of the argument after 1916, and ultimately ends up as a member of Parliament, and then ultimately he drops out of politics in 20 to rebuild his business and his family life and so on. But he does become, inevitably, he becomes the sort of local Fianna Fáil grandee until his death. But the point about Maloney, from my point of view, is his sons, my great-grandfather Jim, his brother Con, who was Deputy Chief of Staff and Adjutant General in the Civil War, and the youngest brother Paddy, who was killed in May 1921 outside Tip Town. He was wearing an Irish volunteer. I never knew much about Paddy. He was wearing an Irish volunteer captain's jacket because he'd just been at a court-martial where they had sentenced to death, he and 3 other officers, a one-armed man called, I can't remember his surname, but he was a plasterer from Tip Town, an ex-soldier whom they reckoned was a spy. Right? And then one of them decided maybe he should connect brigade headquarters, so they let the man go. Right? But here we are, I'm sure my great-uncle would never sentence a man to death without evidence, I don't know. But it's an awkward moment, you see what I mean, in the family narrative. And in fact, as I say, they let the man go, and the next morning, Sean Duffy, the 4th Battalion, 3rd Brigade, Tipperary thing, and Paddy are both killed in a raid on a Maloney farm outside the town. And there's plenty of other examples in my own family and elsewhere of where, when you go into the detailed records, you may find that your grandmother or your grandfather may have been, our great-grandparents, they may have been victims, but also, depending on your background, be it military, be it police, be it civilian, be it IRA or Republican, they may have done things which we would say are terrible, are awkward, are problematic. And I think what we now should do, and this is back to Micheál Martin's point, we should attempt, we have enormous resources which are increasing and increasing. The Bureau of Military History is one, read it with care. The military service pensions records, which are enormous, are another. We have enormous material on separatist activism in this era, and it's growing and growing, for women as well as for men, right? The late Sean Cromian, who died just 2 weeks ago, his mother wrote an account of how she trailed a man, right, who is believed to have been the man responsible, an ex-soldier for trailing Dick McCree and Peadar Clancy, who were arrested the night before Bloody Sunday and then murdered in Dublin Castle. And she proudly writes this for her military service pensions thing. I'm not saying she shouldn't have been proud of it, but here's a woman writing about how I traced this man afterwards. He was shot in a pub up near Grange Gorman. So we have this enormous wealth, increasing wealth, but with that wealth comes, you can say, well, now my grandmother, this isn't great. But equally you might think, Jesus, you know, is this a part of the family history we want to hear? What we don't have, and I'll end here, I promise, Chairman, what we don't have at all is any sense, because this is an all-island conflict that happens. It's not, you know, you can't partition, you can't leave what becomes the 6 counties out of this. What we have, there's not a trace. For example, if we take it that loyalist gunmen of one kind of groups killed, I would guess, about 200 people between 1920 and 1922. A bit more in Belfast probably, but these are armed loyalist civilians, right? And also members of Special Constabulary. There isn't this parallel set of historical materials, you see what I mean, to show what they thought at the time, to show what they told their children, the songs, the commemorations they attended or didn't attend. There's a complete absence within, if you like, militant unionism, I would call it, of memory. Now, in some ways that may be good because they don't just get drunk and sing the Boys of Kilmichael or the Orange version, right? But it is very disturbing historically because it means we don't interrogate loyalist violence at all in this era. We just take it for granted. Like if you were a Catholic, I mean, we talk about homes being burnt, and there is a lot of talk about the big houses of Ireland and all that, and it's pity about them. It's also a pity about Pj Maloney's premises in Church Street in Tipperary. It's a pity about hundreds of houses, scores of houses, certainly in Cork, Little houses as well as big houses that got knocked down as official or unofficial reprisals. And we're sorry about Patrick Street and the City Hall in Cork too, right? Aren't we? But we somehow don't take a rounded view, it seems to me, of a lot of the violence that people experienced on the island of Ireland in this era. And what I'm saying is that the paradox is the growing weight of records disclosing Republican, if you like, and separatist accounts of things is going to skew things more. No matter how critical we are of that material or how analytical, there is this void where the study of loyalism in particular should be. I mean, that's a task for you young people, you young researchers, not for old dogs like me in the future. So perhaps to end, I think particularly in this, I'm not sure of the term, would I say community, would I say this region or whatever, but Cork especially as the most after 1916 is by far the most violent place in terms of fatalities, which is this metric that I've used for studying the Irish Revolution. But there's a whole palette of different kinds of violence and different kinds of death, right? But there's no question that particularly, perhaps, I mean, for example, in Dublin, there just isn't an issue to do with a memory of sectarian killing or anything like that. Now, there sure as hell is in Belfast, and there sure as hell is in Cork, except that some people say, oh, there was no sectarian killing here. We'd never, my grandfather, great-grandfather would never, shot a Protestant because he was a Protestant or whatever. And I think there are awkward issues in this part of Ireland. I'm near, boy, talk about digging your own grave. But there are awkward issues, particularly in this part of Ireland, which are very much prey to the kind of the interventions of contemporary politics, which is a pity, because I think we need to explore the island of Ireland without setting preconditions that are we were all saints and scholars and the other shire were only land-grabbing bastards or whatever. Okay, I'll end there. Thank you.